Welcome to Call to Serve, the keynote plenary of the Phi Beta Kappa Key into Public Service convening. I'm Fred Lawrence, the Secretary and CEO of the Phi Beta Kappa Society. Thank you all for joining us today. As America's most prestigious honor society, Phi Beta Kappa champions the arts, social sciences, natural sciences, mathematics for their value to the individual, but also to their communities, to the nation, and indeed to the world. Phi Beta Kappa members, and that includes 17 American presidents, 41 Supreme Court justices, 38 current members of Congress, understand that the training in the liberal arts and sciences and the pursuit of excellence in the liberal arts and sciences is a perfect pathway to a career in public service and to a career that is meaningful, that is productive, and that is engaged. Students of the liberal arts learn to be problem solvers, analysts of material, to think synthetically across different areas, all of the skills that are needed for public service. And our focus on public service today really couldn't come at a better time. Within the next few years, 25% of the federal workforce is going to reach retirement, which means the opportunities for recent graduates and new graduates are extraordinary just at this time. Now, for people thinking about careers into public service, there are a number of questions that will typically come to mind. How do I start a career in public service, particularly if I don't have any particular personal connections? What can I do to make that transition from campus to a public service career? What sort of gaps might I have in my education that I should fill with internships or other kinds of experiential learning? We are very fortunate today to have an outstanding panel to help answer this and related questions. Ambassador Nicholas Burns, Dr. Abdul El-Sayed, and Dr. Maya Shankar will help us explore these questions by discussing their journeys, their experiences that have led to impactful and extraordinary careers in public service. Now, before we begin our conversation, I do want to recognize the 20 remarkable inaugural Key into Public Service scholars for Phi Beta Kappa who have received $5,000 scholarships. These are each students studying the liberal arts who seek to make a pathway into public service. They were chosen from among well over 600 applicants themselves, all highly qualified applicants. This group of 20 scholars are nothing short of extraordinary. So we congratulate you and welcome you for being part of our convening plenary tonight. So now it's my particular pleasure to introduce our three panelists. I'll do them in alphabetical order because each is extraordinary in his own way. There's no way to rank them other than alphabetically. So I'll start with Nicholas Burns. Ambassador Burns is one of the greatest secretaries of state we've never had in the United States, or at least not yet. He is the Goodman Family Professor of the Practice of Diplomacy and International Relations at the Harvard Kennedy School. He holds the faculty chair of the Future of Diplomacy Project and also of the Project on Europe and the Transatlantic Relationship at the Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. He has served in the United States government for 27 years as a foreign service officer, earning respect as a nonpartisan expert, having served under 3 presidents of both parties. Among the positions he has held is Undersecretary of State Political Affairs, the U.S. Ambassador to NATO, State Department spokesperson, and many others. He is a member of Phi Beta Kappa, inducted at Boston College, where he majored in history. He also earned a master's degree from Johns Hopkins School for Advanced International Studies. Welcome, Ambassador Burns.
Thank you.
Dr. Abdul El-Sayed is a physician, an epidemiologist, an activist, an educator, an author, a speaker, and on top of all that, goodness knows how there's time, he is the host of the widely listened to podcast America Dissected on Crooked Media. And for those who haven't listened, you should. And when you do, as we were discussing before in the virtual green room, there is a theme song that will be stuck in your head forever, but you'll be the better for it. He is a scholar in residence at Wayne State University and American University, where he teaches at the intersection among public health, public policy, and politics. he served as the health director of the city of Detroit and was the youngest health official in a major American city at the time. He's also the chair of Southpaw, Michigan, and a political contributor at CNN. And his new book, Healing Politics, diagnoses our country's epidemic of insecurity. He is a member of Phi Beta Kappa at the University of Michigan, where he majored in biology and political science. He also earned a doctorate in public health from Oxford University, where he was as a Rhodes Scholar, and a medical degree from Columbia University. Welcome, Dr. El-Sayed.
Thank you.
And last, but most certainly not least, Dr. Maya Shankar, who is the global director of the behavioral economics team at Google. Now, she came to that position with just about the best preparation one could imagine. She was the senior advisor in the Obama White House, where she founded and served as the chair of the White House's behavioral science team, which was a team of scientists charged with improving public policy using research insights about human behavior. She also served as the first behavioral science advisor to the United Nations under Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. She is a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Yale College, where she majored in cognitive science. She holds a PhD from Oxford, also on a Rhodes Scholarship, and a postdoctoral fellowship in cognitive neuroscience at Stanford. And as if all of that were not enough, she's also a graduate of the Juilliard School of Music's pre-college division and a former private violin student of the legendary maestro Yitzhak Perlman. Now, if any of you has a question for our wonderful panel this evening, please type it into the chat function on our YouTube live stream. We'll try to get to as many of those questions as we can during the Q&A period of the event. And I certainly encourage you to carry the conversation on the Twitter using our hashtag PBK Public Service, PBK, all caps, Public Service. So let's get started. Ambassador Burns, let me turn to you and ask you a question that I bet you get asked all the time, particularly with your friends who have kids who are thinking of going into public service. And that is, what do you think makes for the best preparation for aspiring diplomats? You know, what do you think of as some of the essential skills that a student interested in foreign service ought to pursue? I know you yourself majored in history in college. Is that what you'd suggest? Or are there other suggestions you have if someone said, I think I want to be a diplomat? How would you suggest they spend their time in college?
Well, Fred, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you. And I just want to say, after having just heard the introductions of Dr. Shankar and Dr. El-Sayed, I'd ask all my questions to both of them. They're extraordinary people, so I'm really honored to be with them. It's the first time we've met, and I look forward to hear from them. Fred, I'd say, you know, with any of us, if you ask that question to any of the three of us, people need to find their passion in life. What excites them, what motivates them, what kind of contribution do they want to make to the world? And so in my case, it was diplomacy, simply because I'm so old, obviously the oldest person in this on this panel, that I came, as a teenager, Vietnam was ending and Watergate was beginning. And it was a time much like this: crisis in government, lack of trust in our national leadership, terrible decision-making in the case of Vietnam, where we lost 58,000 people. And I simply got interested in international politics, not because my parents were involved in it, because these were the issues that we heard about at school, at church, and the dinner table. And so it became passionate for me that the United States needed to do better in the world than the failure of Vietnam and the failure of Watergate. I think that's just find your passion. For diplomats, we need to be protean people. Like Dr. Shankar, if you look at her biography, and Dr. El-Sayed. In our case, you've got to understand history and politics, but you also have to be economically literate. And in this day and age, how can you not know something about pandemics and public health, Dr. El-Sayed's expertise? And certainly, given the dominance of technology in our economy and in our future, you've got to be more than conversant in technology. I'd also say foreign languages. It shows respect for other people when you learn their language. And if you're posted abroad as a diplomat for the United States or any country, you better learn their language and learn it well and show that respect that comes with cultural understanding. And in that case, I'll just say very briefly, one of the formative experiences I had just after graduate school was to go to the Islamic Republic of Mauritania and live there. I'd never been to a Muslim country. And then I lived in Cairo, my wife and I. Then we went to East Jerusalem and lived in a Palestinian neighborhood. We had 3 successive experiences living in the Muslim world. And we were Catholics. We had, somewhat of an insular upbringing in Massachusetts. It was an eye-opener. It changed the way we looked at that incredible world religion, Islam. And it's been a real gift to us, I think, to my wife and I and to our kids as we've learned more about Islam. So that's part of being a diplomat. You need to respect other cultures and other religions, and you got to like people. That's my last characteristic. Diplomacy is a people business. You're Donald Trump's dealing with Xi Jinping, and Vladimir Putin's dealing with Angela Merkel. You got to find a way to communicate. Make sure that you're understanding them, listening, and they're understanding you. And that's all in the cause of what we all believe in: peace, justice, these grand ambitions that we should all have for what we want our country to be. You got to like people and be able to deal with people.
So it sounds like a broad program, but also one that is fueling a passion and a desire to do good in the world, but also on an individual level, to interact with individual people.
That's right. That's right.
Put in a small plug for the home team here. Phi Beta Kappa has always had a language requirement as one of our requirements for membership, as the 3 of you undoubtedly know, and many people listening will know. And I don't mind saying that I've gotten some pushback from some who've said, isn't it time we drop that, given the fact that here it comes, everybody speaks English. Well, I've got several answers to that, and Nick Burns, you just gave me another. So I will add that to the repertoire of why at least a second language is an essential part of being an effective citizen of the world and even an effective member of your own communities. Dr. El-Sayed, let me turn to you and your college background and where it brings you. So you majored in both biology and political science, and then you wind up doing the intersection of medicine and health issues and public policy issues. So it seems like a direct line, but my experience is that it only looks like a direct line in retrospect. It's got a lot of zigs and zags as you're living it. So how direct a line was it? How many zigs and zags were there? And in particular, if you would, were there mentors along the way who helped either in the positive sense of helping you see where you're going, or maybe not so helpful in terms of saying, you have a medical degree, young man, go be a physician, go be a clinician, and don't do what you're doing. So how did the mentors relate, and what did the line look like as you were living it?
Yeah, no, I really appreciate the question. And first and foremost, it's really a privilege to be with you. Professor Burns, really incredible to hear your perspective, and you're conducting a masterclass in diplomacy as we speak. So I deeply appreciate that. And Maya, I've heard a lot about you, but never got to meet as well. So I really look forward to meeting. And Frederick, thank you for holding this space. Look, I often think that the way we tell a story is always told backwards, and that you're right, tends to obfuscate the zigging and the zagging that happens. And for me, the choices about what I studied and what I chose to engage with had a lot more to do with the question of why than the question of what. And my why question, I think, was always framed in the experience of having been the perpetual other. And what I mean by that is that I was raised by my father, who's an Egyptian immigrant, and my stepmom, who is a daughter of the American Revolution. And even in my own family, right, there was always a question of how do these different folks communicate or miscommunicate with each other. And then I would spend a lot of my summers in Egypt, where I would spend most of my time with my grandmother, who is the wisest and most intelligent person I have yet to meet in my life, but never got the benefit of going to school. And she lost 2 babies before the age of 1 of the 8 to whom she gave birth. So in my father's family alone, there was an infant mortality rate of 25%. And my grandmother would always pull me aside when I'd come to Egypt as the haughty American kid. And she'd pull me aside and she'd point to one of my cousins and say, that one's smarter than you. Point to another one and say, that one's better looking than you. Point to a third one and say, that one's taller than you and better looking than you and smarter than you. And her point was that there is nothing special about you. There's something special about the opportunities that you have. And that was the lesson, I think, in those 15-hour trips between my suburban home in just outside Detroit and Alexandria, where my father grew up. And then the crazy thing is that when I would travel those 15 hours, I traveled 10 years difference in life expectancy. And I could travel the same 10-year life expectancy gap going 25 miles south on I-75 into any neighborhood in Detroit. And that was the why question that framed a lot of my career. How is it that we address that deep difference in access to a long, healthy life, access to being able to count 2 of the 8 babies that you give birth to as alive? And that framed what I wanted to do. So I went to medical school with the goal of being able to do something about that difference, only to come to appreciate that the way that our healthcare system is structured, it's actually often part of the problem. And I had some really great mentors, as you mentioned, Frederick, some that understood that there was something bigger than the what question, and that a career shouldn't really be framed around a what do you want to do when you grow up, but more around a why are you doing what you're doing, and how do you want to contribute to a solution. And I had some mentors, in medical school in particular. I made a decision not to pursue a residency, which is not the common thing that a medical school graduate does. And I remember I had one mentor of my 4th year who sat me down and said, "Listen, I'm only telling you this because I care about you." And then he proceeded to say, "You're going to come back to this hospital."
That never introduces a compliment.
No, but you're going to come back to this hospital on your hands and knees begging for a residency. And I was like, wow. I mean, I could see myself coming back, but like, why am I on my hands and my knees? Is there like, am I going to lose the use of my legs because I'm not doing a residency? Anyway, all of that is to say that that oftentimes, if you can frame your why, the question of what follows, and you'll find, as I'm sure is the case with Maya and with Nicholas, that sometimes your career winds and zigs and zags as you find the set of skills that you want to pick up on the path to being a contributor to the how of the why question. And you'll find that oftentimes the way that you thought you were going might not have been the best way. And of course, we don't tell that in the backward telling of the story, but I do think it helps you. And I'm grateful that I went to medical school, even if I don't practice in the most consistent way as most doctors. But I do think that that's an important part of my story, and I'm grateful for it.
Part of your advice is to find that question that preoccupies you, and then find ways through how you're going to engage with that question.
That's right.
You probably know the story of the great Nobel laureate Isidore Rabi, who when he was asked, when did he become a scientist? He said, when he was a little boy, when he came home from school, his mother would always say to him, Izzy, did you ask a good question today? And from the moment that's how he was raised, he thought that's what a scientist is. And it was about looking for that question. And anyone who's done graduate level work knows finding the project is about half the work. Yes, you have to execute on the project, but finding the project is a big and hard piece of the work.
That's right.
Dr. Shankar, you smiled when I talked about zigs and zags, and life is not always the path that you expect. Kierkegaard said life has to be lived forward and understood backward. So I'm sure you've had the occasion to understand a great deal. You started out on a very promising career to be a concert violinist. To study with Yitzhak Perlman is a rare and singular honor, and yet that's not what circumstances held for you. So what was the path from what had to be an injury-related disappointment into this extraordinary career in behavioral science?
Yeah, well, I want to just echo my fellow panelists' remarks and say I'm deeply humbled to be a part of this group today. And I do resent that my name is the last in the alphabet, because I don't like having to answer all these questions after hearing such elegant responses from Ambassador Burns and Dr. El-Sayed, but I will try my best. So yeah, I think actually to underscore Dr. El-Sayed's points, I absolutely agree that when you hear these bios that are read, including my own, it can seem like it was destiny and this path just unfolded effortlessly. And it was always going to be the case that Maya went from a violinist to a cognitive scientist. Oh wait, just kidding. She's now a public servant. Oh wait, now she works at Google. And I just want to emphasize how at so many points in my career, I was filled with anxiety and uncertainty and really had to figure out if there was in fact a path forward for me somewhere. And so I don't want to glamorize the process at all, and it took a lot of confidence building and struggle along the way. So if you're feeling any sense of anxiety with graduation and not knowing if you're choosing exactly the right path, one, that's totally normal. But two, even if you choose the wrong path, I'm proof that you can always course correct. And if you're denied that path, even if you wanted it, you can also find another path forward. So just to reassure you on that front. So as was just said, I was most of my childhood was spent playing the violin, and my dream was to become a professional violinist. And I felt like this dream might actually come true when I was in high school and had been studying at Juilliard, and then got this enormous privilege to study under Itzhak Perlman, which made me feel like I was that much closer to my dream. So my goal was to go to a conservatory for college and make music my full-time gig. And then the summer before my senior year of college, or senior year of high school, I had an acute hand injury. So I tore a tendon in my left hand. It led to a career-ending set of injuries. I guess Dr. Al-Sayed might appreciate this, but I was misdiagnosed with juvenile rheumatoid arthritis, and 7 years later, they were like, JK, you don't actually have it. Anyway, longer story. But the reality is I wasn't able to play the violin anymore. And this is a really traumatic experience because violin was everything for me. I was so singularly focused on it. Every day had so much meaning and purpose that I derived from learning this instrument and honing my craft. And then all of a sudden it's taken away. And I was just worried that I would never find anything that I was as passionate about. And I was just lucky. So I was helping my parents clean out their basement one day over the summer. I was supposed to be, my counterfactual world involved being in China touring with my fellow musicians, but in a more unglamorous state of the world, I was helping my parents organize their bookshelves. And I stumbled across a book called The Language Instinct by Steven Pinker. And it was a story into, sorry, my computer is locked me out. There we go. It was a book that articulated how a seemingly simple, in my naive mind, trait, like the ability to understand and produce language, is actually the result of really complex cognitive machinery. And all of a sudden it hit me. I was like, wow, yeah, I've totally taken my ability to engage with language for granted my entire life. And you think about it a little harder and you realize, wow, when you're a little kid, they don't enroll you in a language boot camp, right? They're not sitting you down, teaching you grammar structures. They're not pausing between every word to show where one word ends and the next word begins. It's just a continuous flow of auditory inputs. And somehow the child's brain is able to parse this incoming stream into these meaningful units that carry meaning and help shape their understanding of the world. And I was just instantly fascinated by this because I remember thinking, well, this is the case for language, which is something, again, so seemingly simple, and it's something that most people have the ability to do. What is the cognitive machinery involved in more sophisticated abilities, like the ability to do complex math, or what it means to fall in love, or what it means to grieve, right? Like it just in front of my own eyes, I just found myself marveling at the human mind. And so that's what ended up leading me down this path. I was really fortunate because my undergrad institution had an interdisciplinary major called cognitive science, and allowed me to investigate the mind from multiple different perspectives. So from the perspectives of philosophy, neuroscience, computer science, linguistics, and psychology. And I was able to ask central questions about the mind that approach them again from these multiple academic disciplines.
So an interesting common thread among the three of you, it is that, I think you've each used the word passion. I think I would add the word, if I might, delight. A question that just gives you delight to try to explore it. And that it's something you can't fake, and it also turns out to be something that can't be given to you. But that you do discover it, and then it does, if you let it, it takes you on in all sorts of directions. But it does seem to hang by a slender thread sometimes. You might have been in a different part of the bookshelf and found a different book, but perhaps you and Pinker were destined to find each other. But the question lit you as soon as you heard it. Dr. El-Sayed, let me come back to you and move now a little further on into your career. and that is having the opportunity to, at the age of, if I have this right, 31, to become head of the Health Commission in Detroit, which was a city itself that was just 2 years out of bankruptcy at that point. And so part of what your job was to do was to deal with that city's health department that had just been privatized. You don't do it the easy way, do you? And that's an enormous undertaking for anybody, certainly for a young person really just starting out. So a couple of questions. First of all, because everybody who was listening is thinking this, so I might as well ask it. How'd you get that job? But you know, a little more broadly, what did it teach you about leadership, being in that position at that time, with all of the pressures that were coming from that? And how did it affect your perspectives on public health?
Yeah, the simple answer to your first question is I was the only one naive and dumb enough to take it. I think the the more complex answer was, and I pick on a thread that Dr. Shankar has weaved into, and Ambassador Burns was talking through, is that almost all of, I think, the most fulfilling insights and work that one does is when you find yourself working across multiple different skill sets at the same time, and the interplay between them, and even the arbitrage between them, I think is where you pick up so many of the most interesting threads. And I always find that people who have a real set of passions that are not just one thing tend to be a lot better at the thing for which they are known, because they're always taking the patterns that may come from a different discipline or a different background and applying them directly. And so for me, I had thought, you know, after deciding not to pursue a residency, that I thought that the work that I wanted to do was around researching and better understanding the social determinants of public health. And so spent a couple of years as a professor and found that, you know, I enjoyed doing research, but I far more enjoyed the advocacy following the work. So once we finished a paper, I was a lot more interested in asking, all right, so how are we going to get this to the world? And I also found that, you know, the other skill set that I was really excited about was, how do I work the bureaucracy of this large labyrinthine system to get something done? And I realized that, you know, if that was the part of the job I was most excited about, I should probably spend most of my time doing that. And I'll be honest, a good friend of mine from a fellowship had just taken a job at the city of Detroit with the mayor who had recently been elected. And I was back home from New York, where I was working for a couple of weeks. And I reached out to him and happened to bring a couple of CVs. I left one and got a call 2 weeks later from the mayor, who asked if I was interested in the public health job. And at that point, I had no idea what the public health job was, but I knew I was interested in it. So spent the next 2 weeks learning as much as I could about the history of Detroit public health, and learned about a city that had made a decision to shut down its 185-year-old health department as it was facing bankruptcy. And the realization that it had dropped so many of the most important balls for public health for a city that fundamentally needed it. Detroit is the poorest major city in America. It is also the largest predominantly Black city in America. And so 2 weeks later, I met with the mayor, and I put together a slide set about what I think we needed to do in the city if we were serious about taking on some of the biggest challenges in a city where threefold the probability of asthma hospitalizations than the rest of the state, that had fourfold the probability of lead exposure. And I was offered the job. And so at that point, it was a major conversation with my life partner and wife, Sarah, who had just started residency in New York, and talking a little bit about what, you know, public service was, and what the responsibility for this work was, Detroit being a place that was home to both of us, and came back home. And I will say that the job was uniquely fulfilling. Was the word that I'd use, because it was that opportunity to take the theory of public health, apply it in a bureaucracy that was just coming back to life, that was in many ways broken, and then think about how you listened and learned from a community of folks about what they needed, and then turned that back into bureaucratic machinery that solved problems. And I remember one example was, we realized that, you know, kids in our school district, despite the fact that, you know, we were testing kids for for vision deficits. They weren't getting glasses because oftentimes that information would go back home, and it wouldn't necessarily mean that a kid would get a pair of glasses because of the challenges oftentimes in a child's home in terms of just the ability to afford a full optometric exam and glasses on the back end of it. So we built a program to guarantee every child a pair of glasses delivered at school. And I remember the first time I put a pair of glasses on a kid and said, you know, this is a very simple thing, right? Corrective eyewear is probably one of the most simple things you can do for somebody. But the bureaucratic lift of being able to do that at scale consistently was part of the work. And then thinking about what the implications could be for a child. I remember being, you know, one of the few brown kids in the back of a class of mostly white students. Now, that wasn't the circumstance for a lot of our kids in Detroit, but I also knew that, you know, as a kid who got in a ton of trouble when I was a kid, I know what it's like to be the one who's singled out because, you know, you're entertaining yourself oftentimes at the cost of everyone else in the class. And so you can imagine a kid who can't even see the blackboard, who is a smart kid, but is in a 40-person room, sitting in the back, can't see the blackboard and getting bored. Getting that kid a pair of glasses so that they can actually see the lesson at the front of the room fundamentally changes the trajectory of that child's life. And thinking about how you can connect the theory of public health and the intervention of public health with the bureaucratic lift and the communications work and the leadership that it takes to be able to move something forward. And so seeing how you can take different pieces of your interests and apply them together, you know, that political science and biology, to create an outcome for somebody that can help change the trajectory of their life. I think that is the essence of what public service is made of. And I'm really privileged and grateful that I had an opportunity to be able to do that kind of work.
And when you think about lessons learned about leadership, how would you, when you felt you got it right, when you felt like you were really driving the institution the way you wanted to, what were the attributes of making that happen?
So I'll say a couple of things. I think it was the ability to inspire people to believe in what they could do when we all worked together towards something. And, you know, I inherited a department that had been privatized multiple times, and I had never worked in municipal public health, but being able to empower people to see the efficacy of what they were doing, if we were able to mount that work together, was one part of it. The second part of it, though, was also about being able to create the narrative in public that matched the narrative in private to create the space for movement, right? And that narrative building and the stories we tell each other about who we are and who we want to be, I just think is so powerful in terms of creating the space for real change. And then the third, we often focus on what's said by a leader, right? There's a sense of a leader standing in front of a room and saying stuff, but it's often the voices that you lift and you listen to that I think is the most powerful part of leading. And when somebody knows they've been listened to and empowered, and they hear a leader repeating the verbiage that they used to describe their challenges, oftentimes it's that ability of empowering people to lead themselves and to lead their own communities that leaders can uniquely do by virtue of a position. And so I think there's a big difference sometimes between the work of leadership versus the positionality of leadership. And one of the challenges I think we see oftentimes with the positionality of leadership is that I think real leaders have the ability to be strong with people with power and to be humble with people without it. And oftentimes you see people in positions who are meek among people who are more powerful than them, and then arrogate themselves over people without power. And I just think that, you know, the act of leading doesn't necessarily require a position, and not everyone in a position leads. And I think it is incumbent on folks who are thinking about developing as public servants to always be leaders and decide to lead. And usually that means that you're doing more listening than talking. That means that you are constantly thinking about how you bring yourself and you show up in a space based on the power differentials that exist, and that you're always asking, how do I generate a narrative and how do I tell stories that get us where we need to go from where we are right now?
Thank you. Great insights on leadership. Dr. Shankar, you know a little bit about being with leaders, having advised the President of the United States and Secretary General of the United Nations. But I want to turn the lens around. Rather than asking you about what they knew or didn't know as you were advising them, thinking about advising aspiring public servants, young people going into public service, what are the things about behavioral economics, behavioral science that you think they would benefit from knowing in terms of the kinds of decisions they'll have to make, the kind of positions they'll have?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, to your earlier point, President Obama knows everything all the time, so he's basically just constantly advising everyone else. He doesn't need advice. He's a legend. So one thing that was really interesting about my trajectory into the public sector is that it was so unexpected. So I say this because I think there are going to be Phi Beta Kappa graduates who have majors that don't necessarily lend themselves to, say, government work, and I was certainly in that bucket. So rewind the clock, I'm doing my postdoc at Stanford in cognitive neuroscience. I distinctly remember, to Abdul's point, doing lab research. I was scanning this dude's brain in a basement in the Stanford laboratory. And I remember thinking, man, I'm like peering inside this guy's brain, and I like have not even had a conversation with him. I feel like the order of operations is not right here, because I just felt really far too social for that kind of role, and I wanted to work on teams, and the pace of research just wasn't a good fit for me. Now, because of my discipline, right, cognitive neuroscience, there are only a few options I felt out there. So one was you become a professor, right, you go into academia. Another option was maybe you get a UX design or product design role somewhere, or if you just want to jettison the whole thing, you go and become a management consultant. So those are the three worlds that existed in my mind anyway when I thought about next steps. And then I just was lucky because I was talking with my old undergrad advisor, and she shared a story with me about stuff that was happening in the federal government at the time. So this was during Obama's first term. And she shared that the US Department of Agriculture runs a school lunch program for low-income kids, and it provides free or reduced price lunch for kids that are below some poverty line. And it was really unfortunate because despite the fact the program existed, millions of kids were going hungry every single day at school, even though they did qualify for the program. And so the question was why? And leaders in the White House, including Cass Sunstein, who was the head of regulatory affairs at the time, figured out that there was a behavioral problem at play. So yes, there were in fact these eligible kids, but the application process was extremely burdensome to get into the program. And it was hard to overstate just how challenging that would be in the context of these folks' lives, right? So you're asking parents who are already strapped for time and resources, or maybe single moms working 3 jobs just to make ends meet, to fill out a 20-page application form that requires accessing historical tax documents, and it's due on exactly this day in August, and I have to take time out of work in the middle of the day and go to the post office and mail it in, and it just doesn't happen. And then there's also a stigma associated with putting your kids onto a public benefits program, right? Like when I was at the White House, I talked to principals and parents who were like, look, I work really hard for a living and I don't want to have my kid benefiting from a government program. So there was, again, this social element. And so what the government did is they utilized a really classic behavioral economic principle where you change what the default option is. So instead of making eligible kids apply and opt into the program, all eligible students are automatically enrolled using data the state's collecting on them. So for example, their eligibility into other state-funded programs like Medicaid or women's assistance programs. And you use that data to automatically enroll these eligible children. So now you have to take an affirmative step to opt out your kids, but if you don't take any action at all, your kid's getting meals at school every day. And I remember hearing about this story, it was so emotionally resonant, and I thought, oh my goodness, that's what I want to be doing. Like, that's the kind of work that I want to do. And the path forward was not clear at all at this point, because it's great to have a dream job, but the reality is that job did not exist at the White House. And I was also really sheepish about it because I had no public policy experience. So like, how do you even connect the dots? So thankfully, this undergrad advisor gave me Cass Sunstein, again, who's kind of, he's a legal scholar. He's like the most cited law professor, I think, in the world. He must be a contemporary of Ambassador Burns. And I wrote him an email, and I basically said, hi, I'm a postdoctoral researcher. I published nothing of significance that you would care about. I have no public policy experience, but it would be so wonderful if you could in any way support my efforts to work in state or local government. I felt like the Obama White House was just so far away from possible. I didn't even try. And so graciously, and I've just benefited so many times in my life from the generosity of spirit of others who are willing to mentor and coach and make themselves available. He wrote back almost immediately, and he ignored my part about me thinking that the Obama White House was so out here, and said, "I'd love to introduce you to President Obama's science advisor." And I mean, again, Abdul, your story so resonate with me because it's like, wait, what? I didn't even know that this was a thing or an option for me. And 2 days later, I'm interviewing White House officials, trying to convince them that they should build out a new position devoted to behavioral economics, and that the person who should lead this effort is me. And so I think what that experience taught me is you can't always wait for that intersection between your specialty and public service to happen. Sometimes you just have to forge a new path forward that allows for that intersection to exist and to allow for it to flourish and prosper. And in my experience, just trying to be bold and take that risk of sending a bunch of cold emails and just putting in the subject line people who were famous as names, like, you know, my advisor sent me your way, Laurie Santos, she's a big deal, and Cass Sunstein sent me your way, and he's a big deal. So hopefully you just open these emails, just trying to use whatever you can to get the attention of folks, and also just trying to, again, create those intersections where they might not exist, can allow you to enter spaces that you didn't even know were right for the application of whatever your skill set is.
And the importance of reaching out and asking people for help or for advice, which sounds so obvious, but sometimes it can be hard. Cass Sunstein is a big deal. He's one of the, as you say, one of the most prominent legal scholars of his generation, University of Chicago, now at Harvard Law School. And yet you took the time to write to him. And the worst thing that could have happened is he didn't write back. He wasn't gonna hurt you. So you try, and you put a lot of lines in the water and nothing happens sometimes, or sometimes it happens on the first try. But there's a very powerful lesson in that, about that reaching out, and then the connections that he's able to make, and to partially open that door for yourself, but also not to be afraid to ask somebody else to help you open that door a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Ambassador Burns, now I want to go to the sort of the another part of your career. So after all this time in the Foreign Service, you find yourself in positions where you're running things, and sometimes big things like embassies or reporting to the guy who reports to the President of the United States. So where did you acquire the skills, or how did you go about acquiring the skills that you would need to play those leadership roles? Because obviously you have the substantive skills from diplomacy and foreign policy that's necessary when you're thinking about how to be an ambassador or an undersecretary. But part of it is also running a big operation. How do you learn how to do that?
Well, that's such a good question to ask someone who is in the civilian side of the government. Because if you asked a military officer, our military is an extraordinary institution. They give responsibility to sergeants, corporals, sergeants, lieutenants. And so a military officer will have significant management experience and leadership experience, leading women and men into battle at an early age. That's not true with the Foreign Service. We have a very long climb up the bureaucratic ladder. And so I think in the Foreign Service, what I was able to do, and I was just fortunate to do this, is learn from good leaders and watch good leadership in action, and also, frankly, watch some people who weren't very good leaders. And in my case, at a pretty young age, in my early 30s, I ended up at the White House at the end of the Cold War, and I was working for this young woman named Condoleezza Rice. And we were the two-person Soviet team advising President George H.W. Bush. Now, Bush was, this is Bush Sr., we call him Bush 41, the 41st president of the United States. He passed away a year and a half ago at the age of 94. He was a one-term president, but maybe the most successful one-term president we've had in the last century. And I think certainly the president who is best equipped to lead us globally. He knew more about the world and knew more people in the world than anybody else in his generation. So what was his secret that impressed me? Listening and humility. I was amazed my first time briefing him. And of course, I was awestruck and nervous. I was young. I didn't frankly feel worthy to brief the President of the United States. I remember thinking, after Condi Rice and I had briefed him, He listened to us. He just listened and asked a lot of questions. And that's how he acquired knowledge. That's how he led. That's how he showed respect for people. And he used that listening capacity then to help him in his decision making. So I think watching people, watching successful people who can lead men and women is one way to learn how to lead. I must say, and I work for Madeleine Albright, I learned from her the power of principle, standing by your convictions. She's a daughter of, she was a refugee and daughter of Czech immigrants to the United States. They had fled both Stalin and Hitler in her first 10 years of her life. She knew about what freedom meant, and she knew what the lack of freedom meant. And I always admired her. I worked for her as her spokesperson in her first 9 months as Secretary of State. We traveled the world together. And that Madeleine Albright has core principles, and she never compromised on those core principles. And that to me was, she conveyed that sense to the rest of us of leadership. And finally, I'll just, because I tend to learn from other people how to manage, how to lead, how to think about leading men and women. Condi Rice, when she was National Security Advisor, she had a lot of tough experiences. 9/11, the Afghan War, the pursuit of bin Laden, the disaster, frankly, of the Iraq War. And then when she was Secretary of State, she called me back from Brussels. I was ambassador to NATO to be her Undersecretary of State. So what did I learn from her? I learned a lot from her. The importance of kindness. She's an extraordinarily open and kind human being. And when you're working with someone 14 hours a day, and you're in a big institution, and it's a people business, it sure helps when the boss is a nice person. I learned from her, be nice to everybody, because that's how you lead. That's how you motivate people. Dr. El-Sayed was saying that. I mean, that's how you get people to think as a team together, make their thoughts your thoughts, and show that respect. She did something really extraordinary. We were dealing with controversial issues, the Israeli-Palestinian peace negotiations. She led that. She got close to an agreement, by the way, in 2008. How to deal with Putin, how to handle an ascending, willful Chinese government. And she would often say to me and others, let's get the best people in the State Department together Friday afternoon, my conference room, 2:00. Let's talk about the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. I want them to tear apart my policy. This is Condi Rice. I'm going to sit at the head of the table. I want everyone junior to me to come in, question my strategy, question the assumptions I'm making about whether a deal is possible, question my tactics. And I thought, remarkable that she had the self-confidence, but also the humility to say she thought she could learn something from people 2 or 3 or 4 rungs below her. She was Secretary of State in the State Department. So I profited and benefited from just being close to these people, almost by osmosis, learning what works and what doesn't work as you lead people and as you pull people together. And in government, we're a team sport. If you are an individual and you really want to just work with yourself, I mean, and some people are like that, and it's good to discover that about yourself, don't join government. Because government, you check your ego at the door. Dr. El-Sayed probably, I'm sure he found this when he was working in the city of Detroit. It's not about you. It's about the people you're serving, the people of Detroit, or in my case, the people of the State Department, the people we were trying to affect. And Condi Rice taught me that.
I remember being at a leadership workshop one time, and I sat through most of the day with a lot of platitudes and wondered why I was spending my time there. And then it was the moment that was worth the whole day when one of the speakers said, the essence of leadership is service. Mm-hmm. And as soon as I heard that, I realized, and that's a common thread that all of you have said, and it's a paradox, because it seems like the essence of leadership is telling other people what to do. But as you've all said in different ways, that turns it on its head. The essence of leadership is knowing who you're serving, and how that allows you to give a scope to the mission and to lead through. Let me ask you each one more thing, and then I want to turn to some questions that we'll get from our listeners. Dr. Shankar, this is kind of a real nuts and bolts question, particularly for the students on, and that is thinking back now either to yourself as an undergraduate or to undergraduates and graduate students you've worked with either in government or at Google. Can you identify gaps that they would have done well to fill, or put differently, for people now still in college and about to finish college? What are some good boxes they want to make sure they tick? When you start college, everybody tells you how many courses you need for a major in this or that, or distribution requirement. Those aren't the boxes I need, right? I mean those boxes of the things that are going to allow you to be productive and fulfilled in a career in public service. So what are the gaps as you see them?
Yeah, so I think the one that I would focus on is not new in the context of this conversation, because I think everyone's been hinting at it, but real world solutions are inherently really complex, and they do require that you evaluate problems from multiple different perspectives, and that you have many, many tools in your toolkit that you can utilize in the face of, again, a very complex, rich set of challenges. And so the degree to which we can foster within ourselves interdisciplinary learning and interdisciplinary thinking allows us to be more effective public servants. And I think, so Abdul's remarks made me reflect back on one of the experiences I had in the White House, which was the work that we did in Flint, Michigan, following the lead and water crisis. So my teammates and I were working from the White House on information fact sheets around clean water, but we were also on the ground meeting with members of the Red Cross and local leaders in churches and members of the YMCA and whatnot. And when I think about that whole process unfolding, I realize how important these interdisciplinary perspectives are. So to make it a little bit more concrete, when my team first got involved in this initiative, we knew that we were going to be disseminating fact sheets about clean water usage around the community. And the reason why this was important is that misinformation was flying around. Oh, you should actually boil your water. Oh, like, don't trust this version of the filter, trust that version of the filter, blah, blah, blah. And we wanted to make sure that we were just disabusing folks of any misinformation. We're making sure that the correct information got into the right hands. And then, so we're developing these fact sheets, and typically you put that EPA seal on it, and it matters a lot, and that carries a sense of authority. But think about the backdrop, the context in which this water crisis has happened, right? There's been a huge breach of trust between residents and their local government, who had deceived them for years and years and years, and had led to the poisoning of an entire generation of young kids. Do you really think the EPA is going to be that final authority, that source that people are going to believe? Of course not. There's going to be spillover effects because they no longer trust their local government. Why are they trusting authorities in the federal government? And so we go on the ground and we talk to lots of folks, and we realize, okay, this is even more complicated because there's been disenfranchised populations for decades. And really what's at the heart of the water crisis is not just the lead in water, it's people feeling like they don't have a voice in their government, and that they've been lied to, and that government is not a body or entity that they can even trust. And so the solution was so multifaceted. It was not just using insights on the best way to communicate about clean water or the presence of lead in clean water. It was, who should be the messenger in all of this? Like, what is the most trusted authority? Well, it's not members of the EPA. It's, like I said earlier, members of the local YMCA and heads of churches and members of the local Red Cross that we need to have canvass and go door to door and knock and endorse the content on these documents. And then as we think through a broader strategy of healing and repairing those fissures within the community, you better believe we have to call upon so many academic disciplines when it came to trying to figure out solutions. So unfortunately, in that case, the work was cut short because of the results of the 2016 election. But up until that point, had we had a narrow lens, had we come in with just a few tools in the toolkit because we thought we were solving X problem, we wouldn't have realized actually how multifaceted the problem set was, and how many skill sets and how many kinds of expertise were necessary in order for us to make progress on what ended up being structural problems of racism and inequality within the Flint community.
Ambassador Burns, I'm full disclosure, this is going to be an unfair question, but here it goes. You are one of the leading thinkers on American foreign policy and globalization. It's hard to even use the term global right now without thinking of two huge global issues, One is a global pandemic, the likes of which we haven't seen in a century, and the other is a global interaction of issues challenging the basic premises of racial injustice and unfairness in various societies that in some ways started in Minneapolis, but in some ways was waiting to go off literally around the globe. So this is a 3-hour lecture you could give, but I'm going to ask for your best couple of minutes on the question of how should young people thinking about going into diplomacy today and foreign service today think about issues like those two huge global challenges?
Well, Fred, thank you. We could definitely form an entire course at any of our universities on this one question, but I'm going to be very brief. I think the young people listening, watching tonight, they understand what's going on. We're experiencing the greatest set of challenges to American society, certainly since the Second World War and the Great Depression. That was the generation of my parents and probably their great grandparents and grandparents. So we've got 4 crises underway. You mentioned 2 of them. We have the pandemic. 115,000 Americans are dead. We have the largest number of people infected in the world. We have mismanaged this pandemic at the federal level. We've seen a lot of good leadership at the state and local level, but not at the federal level. We've got the crisis of the global recession and the American recession, the highest level of unemployment since 1933. And so for young people watching, they've got to be thinking, how am I going to get a job? Where am I going to work? We have, and the most profound crisis is the third one, the racial crisis, which has bedeviled us, confounded us for 400 years since the first slave ship arrived in 1619 in Virginia. And we who are white Americans have a heavy, heavy responsibility to make this right after the tortured history of the African Americans in our history over 4 centuries. And this is a time, I think, when we are challenged, every single one of us, not just to think the right things and say the right things, but actually do something about it. We've been debating at Harvard, in each of our departments at Harvard, okay, how can we make things better? Are we inclusive enough? Do we have enough people of color at our table and in our seminars and in our classrooms? And finally, Fred, we've got a 4th crisis simultaneous with the pandemic and the economic crisis and the racial crisis, which is existential. We have a leadership crisis. And I don't want to be overtly political, but I have to be honest. Donald Trump is failing America, in my judgment. He is not leading for the country. He's not paying any attention to the pandemic right now. He's denying it's even happening. As yesterday, we had the highest number of infections in the entire crisis. The entire 6 months was yesterday. Texas, Arizona, California, Florida, North Carolina. And so I think, we've talked a lot tonight about leadership. We're seeing the dramatic example of failed leadership by the President of the United States. We just have to do better. And there are plenty of women and men in this country who will do better if they're given the chance. That's how I'm thinking about these 4 crises, interlocked. But I guess finally, so I don't thoroughly depress people listening and watching, we can get out of this and we can transcend these 4 crises. It won't be easy. And several of them may be long lasting. The economic crisis could go on for years until the vaccine is developed and distributed widely. We're all going to be living under the threat of the pandemic. The racial crisis, that's going to take generational change, and young people are leading us forward. And I've been so encouraged in this very dark set of clouds hanging over us by the young people, by the millions who've gone into the streets peacefully in the last 30 days after George Floyd's brutal murder to say, enough, we're going to change America. I don't remember a time like this. I was 12 when Martin Luther King was killed. I was 12, the same age, of course, when Robert Kennedy was killed. I think you have to go back to 1968 to find a time when we were so divided, so fractured, so much hatred. And yet young people are showing such courage and optimism that they think they can change America. We older people should listen to them. I mean that. And I think that's to recognize our fault, to do something. That takes leadership. We need Joe Biden, not Donald Trump.
This is the point when I'm supposed to say that Phi Beta Kappa is a 501c3 organization and we are nonpartisan. I'm grateful for your comments.
Just exercising my First Amendment rights.
And that's what we brought you here to do. So last question and answer for this round, Dr. El-Sayed. I got to ask one other one that I know everybody's thinking, which is you certainly are known well in the public health world. You're known for your podcast, and you're certainly known for your visionary work as a young leader in public health in Detroit. But for a lot of people, you first really came to attention when you did this audacious thing of running for governor. So what made you want to do that, and what did you learn from that experience?
You know, I was never supposed to run for office. I think my dad had realized that his son would someday get involved in politics. He probably stayed back home in Egypt, because at least then he would have made sure that there was no possibility for running for anything. But to me, it was always about the question of the why. And when I was in the city, there were a lot of issues that we were able to make some real progress on. But it also was the first time that I saw exactly how our politics flummoxed the best ideals that come from the grassroots. And I was frustrated by the fact that I was working in a city where since 2014, our city was shutting water off on citizens. And I watched as the same politics that had put corporate interest over the well-being of people poisoned 9,000 kids in Flint, as Dr. Shankar had talked about. And then I watched Donald Trump get elected president. And this is somebody who, you know, not to get too political, but ran on the idea that people who pray like I do should not be free to enter this country. And I knew that I was in a state that was suffering a number of interlocking health challenges. And I knew that my background and my training and the work that I had done in the city could justify that I might be able to lead the state toward a healthier future. And then I also knew that, you know, as somebody raised by a daughter of the American Revolution and an Egyptian immigrant in a Muslim household, that I had a great story to tell about who we are and who we can be. And I felt like this was the time to tell that story. And so I remember getting ready to go back to work in January of 2017 after the holidays, and just not feeling the spark that I usually had to go back to work after a long vacation, and realizing that I needed to do something different. And that's when I decided to run. I had the opportunity to tour an incredible state. Michigan is a great microcosm of the United States generally, and got to meet people in their VFW halls and in their living rooms and in their union halls all over the state. People who live very different lives. And I had thought when I started running that the conventional wisdom would be true, that, you know, if you talk to poor and working Black folk in places like Detroit and Flint versus poor and working white folk in places like Petoskey or the Upper Peninsula, that these folks would not be able to see eye to eye. And I was completely wrong. Same challenges that folks talked about. And, you know, I trained as an epidemiologist. And the thing we do as epidemiologists is try and make sense of patterns of disease. And if you take an epidemiologic view to our politics, I came to the appreciation that really the disease that we all face is a very similar one. And it is a systematic decrepitude in our systems that we have allowed to fester for a very long time, whether it's a system of housing or the system of policing or the system of healthcare or the system of voting itself, that it has been driven by the narrow interests of a small number of very, very rich institutions and corporations rather than the well-being of everyone else. And I saw how that both shaped the challenges that I was trying to solve as a health director and the kind of politics that we needed to bring that forward. And I leave you with this, that I think that we have a far brighter future ahead of us. And I say that as a relatively young person, but also as someone who's taken the time to actually look folks in the eye and ask what's wrong. And I think we can get there if we can do a couple of basic things. Number one, if we can focus more on winning the future than winning the argument. Social media doesn't really help us because it unfortunately biases our first instincts, not our best instincts. And then two, if we are able to bring a certain level of empathy to ask not what are you saying, but why are you saying it? And how does what you're saying change the way I think about what I'm feeling, and how can I help us to see that we share a common lens on a common set of challenges, rather than falling into the classic problem of being pitted against each other by folks who have a lot more power than any of us. And so whether it's generational, or it's racial, or it's ethnic, or it's religious, or it's geographic, we are constantly told that the others are the ones who are the reasons why we suffer, rather than the brokenness in the systems that we face. And so if we're able to come together around solving those problems, I believe deeply in the future that we can build. That is a question of courage, though. And I really hope that we can have it. I'll be honest with you. I look at the young folks nowadays, similar to Ambassador Burns, and I know that we do have that, and it's a matter of time, and that's why I am so hopeful.
Well, on that hopeful note, I want to do a couple of questions from the audience, and here's what I propose. I've got several that I want to share, and then let's go in deference to Dr. Shankar. We'll go in reverse alphabetical order this time, unlike the way we started out. And you can each pick one, and you could talk about one of the same ones if you think there's something that you want to add to what one of your colleagues said. But these are three different questions that came from the audience that I think are most thoughtful. Did you ever feel disillusioned while working in public service? I don't take that to be a depressing question. I take that to be a very serious question. The good days take care of themselves. Did you ever feel disillusioned at some point while working in public service? What sorts of opportunities should we pursue or create outside the typical public service track? Somebody who's thinking about career planning and not just answering an ad. Actually, I'll give you two more. How important are narratives and communication strategies in enfranchising the disenfranchised, and how do you ensure their success? And then the last one's a pretty concrete one. What are the 2 to 3 concrete steps you would recommend for young professionals hoping to distinguish themselves as they begin their careers? So obviously, if we had time enough, I'd ask each of the 3 of you to talk about each of the 4 of those. But in the time that we have left to us, each one of you take one and share some thoughts on that. So, Dr. Shankar, you get to take one right off the top.
Sure. Yeah. So the question of disillusionment, absolutely. Working in public service and in government requires an incredible amount of grit and perseverance, because you will fail far more often than you succeed. I would say that for every one successful project that the team I built had, there were probably 40 attempts early on that went into that. And that's because oftentimes when you're trying to bring innovative approaches into any space, there's naturally going to be resistance, right? At the very least, inertia is carrying them forward in a certain way. And introducing these new approaches just takes a willingness to venture outside one's comfort zone, take risks, etc. So I think a good example is one of the things that my team tried to encourage government agencies to do was engage in active A/B testing. Now, in the private sector, in tech, for example, A/B testing is just an everyday practice, right? We want to know if this version works better than this version, and we test it empirically, and we can figure out what works best. In the government, that's just not the case. There aren't the technological capabilities that are set up in place that allow you to do rigorous randomized control trials, and it's just not business as usual practice to do that. But in order for my team to be effective and to make sure that these behavioral insights that we were using had the intended impact, we needed to actually have data to show that impact. And so I remember we were working with the Department of Veterans Affairs on a program that helps veterans upon return assimilate better back into civilian society by giving them access to job and career coaching, right? So obviously the transition can be quite jarring. You've been overseas for many years and you're coming back to this country and the government says, hey, don't worry, here's a helping hand. We're gonna help facilitate this transition back into the workforce or whatever educational opportunities you want. And they were seeing low participation in the program, and given budgetary constraints, the only mechanism by which we could boost participation in the program was through an email message. Now, my teammates and I had ideas for different framings, different language that we could use within the context of this email. But it was of paramount importance, again, that we were actually able to test this through an A/B test. And I remember it took 8 months for us to get this email A/B test up and running. And this was monumental for this part of the VA. I remember we even threw like a pizza party once it happened because it was such a big deal. And what we found, just in case you're curious, is that when we framed the benefit not merely as something veterans were eligible for, but as something that they had earned through their years of service, that framing led to a 9% increase in access to the program. And the reason for that is something called the endowment effect, which says we value things more when we feel that we own them or have earned them. And so there's something to lose when you feel you've earned something. So again, that one word change led to this massive difference that we were actually able to quantify because of the email studies. Now, that's a great success story, but I can't tell you the number of times that I felt totally disillusioned because the apparatus had not been in place for us to run what seemed like a seemingly straightforward test. And this was not due to lack of will on behalf of my fellow colleagues within government. Sorry, every time I talk, my computer finds itself out. And so it was not due to lack of will. It was just, again, this was just not business as usual practice. And so there were so many times where these initiatives would get derailed, or there wouldn't be enough funding, or my colleagues didn't feel like they had enough protective cover to take that sort of risk. And it was really just a matter of fighting for what we believed in and trying to give people that space to be innovative within an otherwise constrained environment. And I think if there's one lesson I learned from my violin years, it was that, you know, practice is everything. So like, I just remember being in my practice room as a violinist, you know, working away to passages, it's just not working. And you also want to bang your head against the wall, but you just learn to build that grit and perseverance over time. And I feel like that served me well, because certainly I had so many unglamorous days working in the federal government, and many days where I felt like I just wanted to give up because I had these audacious goals for how we could better serve the American people and people internationally. You just want to see that impact happen. You want to see people's lives improve, but there can be so much red tape and so much to make you feel discouraged. But I feel like in hindsight, I'm so grateful that I stayed the course, and I'm so grateful that so many of my colleagues like lifted one another up during these periods, because one day my colleague who's working on STEM education is a huge victory. The one who's working on space with NASA, maybe less so. And then I had the worst day, and like, you know, we hit equilibrium more or less among the full group within the Science and Technology Office. So I'm grateful to them as well. But yes, absolutely. I've had so many terrible down days, but on the whole, obviously so proud of the impact that the Obama administration had on so many people's lives, because so many career civil servants and political appointees just worked so hard day in and day out to make stuff happen.
Terrific. Dr. El-Sayed.
I really appreciate the question about public service external to public service. And you don't necessarily have to have a position in government to be a public servant. And increasingly, I'll be honest with you, I came to the work of public service focusing on policy, that public service was a means to implementing the kind of policy that could create more equitable and more efficient outcomes for people. And after I got into politics, I realized I had the whole thing backwards. I think that politics and then public service has a lot more to do with being able to efficiently translate cultural ideas into public policy, rather than taking public policy and trying to transmit them into the world and then change culture that way. And in that respect, you know, so much of the work that I do now, I haven't been in a public role or employed by a government since 2016 or 2017. And so much more of what I'm trying to work on now is trying to think about how do we articulate the ideals that we want to instantiate in the world. And a lot of that has to do with culture. And so I'm trying to pick off the two middle questions at the same time. And I think part of that is telling stories about who we are and who we want to be, lifting up narratives that show us why things aren't working and why who we are is not who we want to be, and how we might change if we really did want to become who we wanted to be. And so in that respect, I'm encouraging folks to think not just about careers in public service. And I hope that you do. I hope that all of you find a great role where you can work in government and do some great things, because government, I believe deeply, is in and as a tool of good. But I also hope that for those of you who may not want to work in government or find yourself outside of government for a time, also think a little bit about how you drive the levers of government by having that big public conversation about culture, whether you're an artist or you are somebody who is a storyteller or you want to work in media. All of those are really critical to shaping that narrative and lifting that up. And I do think that we have a deeply inequitable narrative in the world. And so you lifting the ideas and voice of people whose voices and ideas and visages don't get shown and told, I think is really powerful around helping to move government around culture and translating that into public policy.
Thank you. Ambassador Burns.
So I know that Nitin Shanas has asked everyone, is it true that that citizens or lobbyists can call congressional offices and have an impact on how members of Congress vote on an issue? Do they actually listen to the people, I guess is the way I would just describe this very good question. Mm-hmm. And the answer is sometimes it works like that and sometimes it doesn't. I mean, I think one of the problems we have in America is that we have a crisis of democracy in the sense that some people are more equal than others. People with money, because of Citizens United, have more influence on elections than probably all of us on this podcast, because none of us, I think, is a billionaire. And that's unequal, and that's anti-democratic. But there are times when members really do have to listen to their constituents. They're all self-interested. They want to get reelected. So they actually do monitor what their constituents are saying. So your voice can be heard, but I would be dishonest or misleading if I told you it's always going to be heard. Fred, I wanted to talk about, just end on disillusionment. It's such a powerful and important question. It was one of the questions that I really thought a lot about when I was in government, because governments, you make decisions. In my case, in the State Department, what's our policy going to be towards Russia or China or climate change or world poverty? And there are times when you're on the right side and your side wins, or you make the compelling argument, or you write that memo that leads your boss to determine, yeah, we'll go down that road you want us to go down. And you feel like you're on top of the world on those days. There are other days, and sometimes just as many, where you lose. And you might feel very strongly about an issue. You might think there's an ethical and moral or political reason why we need to do something, and you lose the argument. And then in government, if you lose the argument, you don't just lose the argument. You have to go out and defend the argument that you lost against. You have to implement the policy that you argued against. And I think that's the hardest thing for any of us who go into government. I justified it to myself in over 27 years. When I lost, would I go out and represent the government? I had my chance. I was in the room. Hamilton's the room where it happened, right? Or Lin-Manuel Miranda's the room where it happened. Give him the credit. And I put my best foot forward. I put my best argument forward. That's how I justified it. But there are times when I think everyone's got to have this. You need to know what you're willing to do and what you're not willing to do. You need to know that there are certain things you'd resign over or walk away from government over, because you're not going to do anything the government asks you to do. But in terms of disillusionment, let me give the person who asked it a little bit of hope. Go Google tonight after this session, Man in the Arena speech, Teddy Roosevelt, May 1910 at the Sorbonne post-presidency. We're going to update him. The person in the arena, the woman or man in the arena. He basically says in a very long speech, but in a very tight middle paragraph, you need to go at some point in your life into the public square and try to make a difference. And he says it's not the critic who counts. The credit belongs to the man or woman who tries to make a difference, who believes in the great enthusiasms and the great devotions, who knows high achievement, but who, if he or she fails, at least they fail while daring greatly, so that their place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat. And I have that quote framed in my Harvard office. And when students come in for office hours, and I teach graduate students, so they're in their mid-20s to early 30s, and they always have the same dilemma. I've got an offer from Goldman Sachs, and they want to pay me $1 billion a year. I have another offer from the Sisters of Mercy in Calcutta, and they can't pay me, but they've got important work. What should I do? And I point to the quote and say, look, even if you take the Goldman Sachs job, and there is no shame in that, at some point in your life, you need to also work with the Sisters of Mercy or the equivalent, depending on what your interests are. You got to give back so that your place at the end of your life will never be with those cold and timid souls who never went into the arena. Dr. El-Sayed has gone into the arena. He's done the toughest thing I can think of. He put himself in front of the people and said, vote for me. That took guts, it took courage. Dr. Shankar, in her job at the White House, showed that same mettle. So that would be my message to young people. Don't be one of those poor, cold, and timid souls who at the end of their life said, I wish I had tried to move our country or our city or our state forward on the issue you care about.
And to bring us full circle, I'll tell you where Teddy Roosevelt got those ideas and values from. He did, in fact, have a liberal arts education. He is, in fact, a member of Phi Beta Kappa. And if you want to treat yourself to what different kinds of presidents might be, Google what his reading list was while he was president, not in preparation for being president. It includes, among other things, some of the Greek classic works of not only philosophy but literature in Greek, which he could read fluently. And he took that whole liberal arts background, brought it to public service, and I think it leads to the magnificent person in the arena quote that Ambassador Burns has brought us to. I am deeply grateful to all three of you, Ambassador Burns, Dr. El-Sayed, Dr. Shankar, for sharing your wisdom, your thoughts, your journey with all of us. The Society will make videos of today's presentation available online at pbk.org. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please join us throughout the year for additional programming on how you can key into public service. Thank you all for being with us today. Good night.